human found an alien girl injured in his barn. Hours later the sector broadcast named him her abductor. Hello everyone, before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, back to our main character. James Hunter had never imagined his quiet life on the farm would be disrupted so suddenly. A typical morning, just like any other, began with the sounds of the barn door creaking open, followed by the rhythmic clop of his boots on the wooden floor. The chilly air of the early morning brushed against his face as he stepped into the barn, checking on the animals before beginning his day. But then, amidst the hay and the scent of fresh straw, something unusual caught his eye. There, in the far corner of the barn, was a figure, an alien girl, unconscious and severely injured, sprawled across the ground. Her skin, a striking shade of green, shimmered under the dim light, and her long, silver hair was matted with blood. James froze, his mind racing. Who was she? How did she end up here? And more importantly, how could he help her? He rushed to her side, his heart pounding in his chest. Kneeling down beside her, he checked her breathing, shallow, but steady. His hands trembled as he carefully checked her injuries, noting the deep cuts along her arms and the bruises covering her delicate body. Without a second thought, James lifted her into his arms and carried her to the farmhouse. He couldn't leave her there, not in the condition she was in. After laying her down gently on the couch, he quickly bandaged her wounds with what little he had on hand. As he worked, his mind couldn't help but wonder. What did she mean to the world? Was she just another casualty of an endless war between alien factions, or was there more to her story? He couldn't help but wonder if the answers lay somewhere beyond his small, quiet farm. Hours later, just as James was finishing the final touches of her care, a strange noise from his comm device snapped him back to reality. He hadn't expected a message, but the screen flickered to life. A live broadcast from the sector's news station flashed across the screen. The news anchor's voice rang out. A human male, identified as James Hunter, has been named as the abductor of an alien girl found injured in his barn. Authorities are investigating the situation. More on this story as it develops. James stared at the screen, his blood running cold. Abductor? How could they say that? He hadn't kidnapped her, he had saved her life. His stomach twisted in knots. This was going to get out of hand quickly. What had he gotten himself into? As the news report continued, James could feel the weight of the world bearing down on him. He was no longer just a simple farmer. No, now he was a man on the run, caught in a web of misunderstanding and danger that he could never have anticipated. The broadcast ended, but James sat frozen, the words echoing in his mind. He had no idea what would happen next, but one thing was for certain, his life had just taken a turn he never saw coming. James sat in the farmhouse, his fingers gripping the armrest of the couch where the alien girl now rested. The news report had just ended, and his mind raced. He had no idea how the situation had spiraled out of control so quickly. The weight of the accusation hung in the air, suffocating him. He glanced over at her. She was still unconscious, but her breathing had steadied. The bandages on her arms were a makeshift attempt, but they would do for now. She had yet to speak, and James wasn't sure if she ever would. Her eyes, though closed, seemed to glimmer with an unspoken depth, as if she knew more than she was letting on. What had happened to her? Why was she left in his barn? And how had he become the villain in this story? The sound of his comm device chiming broke his train of thought. With a deep sigh, he rose and walked over to the table where the device lay. His hand trembled slightly as he answered the incoming call. A familiar voice came through the static. "James, we need to talk." It was Thomas, an old friend from his days in the military. James hadn't heard from him in years. "What is it, Tom?" James replied, trying to sound calm. "I saw the news," Thomas said, his voice low. You're in trouble, man. They've already got their eyes on you. You need to get out of there, now.
What are you talking about?
James asked, confused. I didn't do anything wrong. I know that, Thomas responded quickly, but they don't. The authorities are going to be all over your place soon. You've got to leave before they find you. James's heart raced. He knew Thomas was right. The situation had escalated faster than he could handle. If the sector's authorities thought he had abducted the alien girl, there was no telling what would happen next. What do you want me to do? James asked, desperation creeping into his voice. I'll help you, but you need to get to a safe place. Trust me, you're not going to make it out of this one alone. The line went silent for a moment. James could feel his pulse thumping in his ears. I've got a place, Thomas finally said. I'll send you the coordinates. But you have to move fast. Without hesitation, James nodded. I'll be there. The call ended, and James stood still for a moment, trying to gather his thoughts. He had no choice. He had to trust Thomas. His eyes flicked back to the alien girl on the couch. She was still unconscious, but he knew he couldn't stay here much longer. The authorities were coming, and he wasn't about to let them take him without a fight. He grabbed his coat and threw it over his shoulders. It was time to go. The alien girl's fate was tied to his now, whether he liked it or not. He had no idea who she was, but he had a feeling that her story was far from over. He couldn't abandon her, not when he was the only one who knew the truth. With one last glance at the farmhouse, James stepped outside. The cold wind hit him immediately, biting at his skin. He pulled the collar of his coat tighter around his neck as he made his way toward his truck. The road ahead was uncertain, but he had no choice but to keep moving. He knew he was running out of time. The farm, the quiet life he had known, was slipping away. But in that moment, all he cared about was getting to safety. He didn't know what awaited him in the future, but he knew one thing: he would protect this girl, no matter the cost. James gripped the steering wheel tightly as the truck bounced along the uneven dirt road, the headlights casting long shadows across the path ahead. His mind raced as the weight of the situation pressed down on him. The authorities were closing in, and every mile he drove only seemed to amplify the urgency of his escape. The cold air outside seeped into the cabin, but James barely noticed. His thoughts were fixed on the girl in the back seat, the alien girl. He still had no idea who she was, but in some strange way, her fate was now intertwined with his. He glanced into the rearview mirror, his eyes briefly meeting her still form. Her breathing was steady, but she hadn't moved since he lifted her from the couch. She was a mystery, and mysteries rarely ended well. The road ahead stretched into the dark, empty wilderness, the glow of distant city lights just a faint memory behind him. James's truck had seen better days, but it was still his only means of getting out of here. He had to keep moving. As he turned a sharp corner, the truck lurched, and James had to fight to keep control of the wheel. His eyes scanned the horizon ahead, looking for any sign of movement, any indication that the authorities might be out there, searching. He couldn't afford to be caught. Not yet. Not until he knew more. The hours stretched on, each passing minute making it feel like his heart was beating louder than the engine. James tried to focus on the road, but the questions kept coming. Who had she been? Where had she come from? Why was she left for dead in his barn? The truth was, he didn't have any answers. All he had was the belief that he had to help her. He couldn't turn back now, not after everything that had happened. The girl shifted in the back seat, her eyes fluttering open for the first time since he found her. James's breath caught in his throat as he glanced back at her. She seemed disoriented, her violet eyes scanning the interior of the truck with confusion. Where am I?" she asked in a voice that was barely above a whisper. Her accent was foreign, musical, unlike anything he had ever heard. James's heart skipped a beat. He wasn't sure what to say, but he couldn't let her feel alone. "You're safe," he said, trying to sound reassuring, though his own doubts echoed in his mind. "I'm taking you somewhere safe." She nodded slowly, her gaze softening as she relaxed against the seat. Safe, she murmured, as if testing the word. James's mind continued to race. He wasn't sure what her next move would be, or what the future held for them. He just knew that whatever happened, he couldn't leave her behind. They were in this together now, whether they liked it or not. The truck continued its journey through the night, and James couldn't help but wonder if the answers he was searching for were waiting just beyond the next mile. But for now, all he could do was drive. Drive and hope that whatever came next, he could protect her. He wasn't just running from the authorities, he was running toward something he couldn't yet understand, but he had to find it. They had to find it. The truck rumbled down the winding road, its tires kicking up dust as the night enveloped the landscape. The moon cast a faint glow over the scene, but James barely noticed it. His focus was entirely on the alien girl sitting silently in the back seat, her eyes closed again, but this time there was a peaceful look on her face. She had fallen into a restless sleep after their quiet conversation, and James couldn't help but wonder what she was dreaming about. What was her life like before all of this? Was she a prisoner? A warrior? The questions piled up in his mind, but there were no answers. As the road stretched on, the cold night air made James shiver, but he ignored it, his thoughts consumed with the situation at hand. He had made the decision to protect her, to get her to safety, and that was all that mattered now. The world outside felt distant, as though it had ceased to exist for the moment. His past life, the simple days on the farm, seemed so far away now, replaced by the urgency of the present. The truck's engine hummed steadily, the sound of the tires on the gravel road filling the otherwise quiet cabin. James's mind wandered back to the broadcast he had seen earlier. It felt like a lifetime ago, yet the words echoed in his ears. Human abductor. The accusation stung. He hadn't done anything wrong. He had just helped her. But now, the world was turning against him, and he didn't know how to stop it. The truck veered off the main road, heading toward a secluded area that only Thomas knew about. James had his doubts, but Thomas had been his friend for years. If anyone could help, it was him. A small, secure cabin in the woods, far from prying eyes, was their destination. It wasn't much, but it was safe. Safe enough for now. The truck's headlights pierced the darkness as they made their way toward the cabin. James's grip on the steering wheel tightened as they neared their destination. He glanced at the rearview mirror again, catching a glimpse of the alien girl's face. She looked so fragile, so vulnerable. A part of him hated that she was in this situation, dragged into a mess that wasn't hers to begin with. But the other part, the part that had made the decision to protect her, felt a sense of responsibility for her well-being. He had no idea what kind of trouble this would lead to, but it didn't matter. He had already chosen his path. The truck slowed as they approached the cabin, a small structure nestled between the trees, barely visible in the moonlight. James parked the truck and cut the engine, the silence of the woods enveloping them. He got out of the truck quickly, walking around to the back to help the alien girl out. She stirred slightly as he opened the door, her violet eyes flickering open, and for the first time, she looked directly at him. Her gaze was intense, but there was something else behind it, gratitude. Or perhaps it was just exhaustion. James extended his hand to her, and after a moment of hesitation, she took it. Her grip was weak but steady. "We're here," James said softly, trying to sound reassuring. She nodded silently, allowing him to help her out of the truck. Together, they made their way toward the cabin's front door, the wooden steps creaking beneath their weight. Inside, the small space was dimly lit, but it had a warmth to it, the kind that made James feel like maybe, just maybe, they would be safe for a while. He led her to a small couch by the fireplace, where she sat down cautiously, still looking around the room with an air of uncertainty. James moved to the kitchen area, grabbing a blanket and a glass of water. He handed them to her gently, his movement slow and deliberate. She accepted the water but didn't speak. The silence between them felt comfortable, yet filled with an unspoken tension. James stood there for a moment, watching her, wondering if she would say something, anything. But she didn't. Instead, she took a sip of the water and then looked up at him, her eyes softening for the first time since they had met. It was a small gesture, but it meant something. James nodded, as if to say that he understood, and took a seat across from her. The night stretched on, and as the fire crackled quietly in the corner, James couldn't help but feel the weight of what was to come. The storm was far from over, but for now, at least, they had a moment of peace. The cabin was quiet, the only sound coming from the crackling fire in the corner. James sat across from the alien girl, who still hadn't spoken much since their arrival. Her eyes, though soft, betrayed a sense of unease. It was clear that she didn't fully trust him yet, and how could she? He was a stranger, and he had no idea who she truly was or why she was here. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that this moment, this quiet, fragile moment, was the calm before the storm. He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, trying to make himself as unthreatening as possible. "I know you're scared," he said quietly, breaking the silence. "I don't know what's happening either. But I'm not going to hurt you. I just want to help." The alien girl, still sitting stiffly on the couch, glanced at him, her violet eyes flicking over his face. Her expression remained unreadable, but there was a flicker of something, perhaps curiosity, or something deeper, hidden beneath the surface. James didn't know what to expect. He had always been a simple man, living a simple life. But now, his world was anything but simple. He had a girl, no, a woman, he couldn't understand, an entire sector after him, and no idea what the future held. It was too much. Too fast. But he had to keep going. He couldn't turn back. The girl shifted slightly, pulling the blanket tighter around her shoulders. James noticed her movements were still slow, deliberate. She hadn't fully recovered from her injuries, that much was clear. She was fragile, vulnerable, but she also had a strength about her, a resilience that James could sense, even though she hadn't said a word in hours. "Are you from Earth?" James asked, the question slipping out before he could stop himself. The alien girl looked at him then, her gaze sharp, her posture stiffening. For a moment, James thought she might respond, but instead, she shook her head, slowly. "No," she said, her voice low but steady. "I am not from Earth." The words hung in the air between them, and James felt a chill run down his spine. She wasn't from Earth. That was the first piece of the puzzle he'd gotten. It didn't answer much, but it was something. "Then where are you from?" he pressed gently, trying not to sound too eager. The alien girl hesitated, her eyes flicking to the window, where the night sky was barely visible through the thick trees. She seemed to be weighing her words carefully. "I am from a place far from here," she finally said, her voice distant, as if she was speaking more to herself than to James. "A place where things are different." James's brow furrowed. He wanted to ask more, to push for answers, but he knew better. She wasn't ready. He could feel it. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, letting the silence stretch. They sat like that for a while, two strangers, trapped in an unknown world, bound by circumstances neither of them could fully comprehend. Finally, the alien girl spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know how long I can stay here." James looked at her, his heart sinking a little. "What do you mean?" "They will come for me," she said simply, her eyes meeting his. "They will find me, no matter where I go." James swallowed hard. He hadn't considered that. The authorities, the ones who had labeled him as her abductor, were just one part of the larger puzzle. Whoever she was, whoever had been chasing her, would never stop. And now, James was caught in the middle of it. He had no choice but to stand his ground. "We'll figure this out," he said, more to reassure himself than her. "I won't let them hurt you. I'll keep you safe, I promise." The alien girl didn't respond immediately. Instead, she stared into the fire, her expression distant. James watched her, a feeling of unease settling over him. He didn't know what he had gotten himself into, but one thing was clear, his life would never be the same again. The morning light filtered through the trees, casting long shadows on the cabin's wooden floor. James woke up early, the silence around him thick and heavy, and the weight of the night before still fresh in his mind. He sat up slowly, stretching his stiff limbs, his gaze automatically moving to the couch where the alien girl had slept. She was still there, wrapped in the blanket he had given her, her chest rising and falling in a slow, steady rhythm. For a moment, he just watched her. Her face was relaxed now, the tension that had been there the night before replaced with a calm expression. But despite her peaceful appearance, James couldn't shake the feeling of unease that lingered in the back of his mind. He had no idea what to do next. His entire life had been turned upside down in a matter of days. The simple life he had once known, the farm, the routine, it all felt like a distant memory now.
What was he supposed to do with her?
He hadn't asked for any of this. But there was no turning back now. The truck, the journey, the decisions, it had all led them here. He had promised to protect her, and he would. James stood up and walked quietly to the small kitchen area, trying not to disturb her. He boiled water for coffee, the steam rising from the mug as the aroma filled the cabin. As he waited, he couldn't help but think about what she had said. "They will come for me." He hadn't fully understood it then, but now the weight of her words sank in. The danger wasn't just from the authorities. Whoever had been after her, whoever had left her in his barn, was still out there. And that meant James was in danger too. After a few moments, he heard a soft rustling from the couch. He turned around just as she stirred, her violet eyes blinking open. She looked up at him, her expression guarded but curious. "Good morning," he said quietly, offering her a warm smile. She didn't respond immediately, but nodded slowly, as if weighing her words. "Where am I?" she asked, her voice still quiet and strained. "You're safe," James replied, though the uncertainty in his own voice betrayed him. "For now." She stared at him for a long moment, her gaze unreadable. "I should have left," she murmured, more to herself than to him. James frowned. "Left? I don't belong here," she said, her voice distant, almost resigned. James took a deep breath, trying to think of something comforting to say. "You're not alone. You have a place here, for as long as you need it." The alien girl didn't reply. Instead, she sat up slowly, pushing the blanket off her legs, her eyes scanning the small cabin. She still seemed unsure, still seemed like she was trying to figure out where she was and what had happened. James could see the uncertainty in her eyes, the fear she was hiding behind a veil of strength. She wasn't as calm as she looked. "What's your name?" James asked gently, hoping to break the tension. She looked at him, her lips parting slightly as if she were going to say something but stopped herself. After a pause, she answered softly, "Aurelia." James nodded, repeating the name to himself. It felt important, like a key to understanding something bigger. "Aurelia," he said. "I'll make sure you're safe. That's all I can promise." She nodded, her eyes softening for a brief moment, but the distance remained. "Thank you," she whispered, but there was something in her tone that made James realize she wasn't fully trusting him yet. And who could blame her? He was a stranger, after all. A simple man who had been thrust into a world of danger and uncertainty. But as much as he tried to reassure himself, James couldn't shake the feeling that he was in over his head. And with that thought, he realized the road ahead would be far more difficult than he had ever imagined. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting a warm, golden hue through the cabin's small windows. James stood by the fire, quietly tending to it as the sound of crackling wood filled the room. He glanced over at Aurelia, who was sitting on the couch, her arms wrapped around her knees, staring out of the window. The quiet between them felt thick with unspoken thoughts. James had done his best to create a sense of calm, but he could tell that Aurelia was still unsettled, still on edge. It wasn't just the circumstances, they were both trapped in a situation they couldn't control. She had made it clear that she wasn't from Earth, but James couldn't begin to understand what that meant. Who was she really? What kind of life had she lived before she ended up in his barn? As he placed another log on the fire, James couldn't help but feel the weight of the responsibility on his shoulders. He had promised to protect her, but how could he protect someone when he didn't even know who, or what, they were running from? "Aurelia," he said gently, his voice breaking the silence. She turned her head slightly but didn't look directly at him. "Do you want to talk about it?" Aurelia took a deep breath, her shoulders rising and falling in a slow, steady rhythm. She didn't answer right away, and for a moment, James wondered if she even wanted to. Then, with a soft sigh, she spoke. "I'm not from your world," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I've been to many others." James's curiosity piqued. "What do you mean?" he asked. Aurelia glanced at him, her violet eyes meeting his for a brief moment before she looked away again. "I am part of a race called the Lycery," she began, her voice distant. "We are explorers, travelers. We seek knowledge, understanding of the universe. But that has made us enemies to those who wish to control it." James leaned forward slightly, his interest growing. "Enemies? Who are you running from?" Aurelia was silent for a long time, her gaze fixed on the fire. James could see the tension in her posture, the way her fingers tightened around her knees. "I don't know how much I can tell you," she said softly. "But they will come for me. They always do." James frowned, his mind racing. "Who are they? What do they want?" Aurelia turned her head slightly, her expression unreadable. "They are the Vellor," she said, the name coming out in a low, bitter tone. "A powerful empire. They seek to conquer everything. And we, the Lycery, are seen as a threat. I've been running for a long time." James felt a chill run down his spine. The Vellor. He didn't know much about intergalactic empires or their politics, but the way Aurelia spoke of them made it clear they were not to be taken lightly. He glanced at her, trying to read her expression, but it was like she had closed herself off again. "What do they want with you?" he asked gently, his voice steady despite the storm of questions in his head. Aurelia hesitated, her lips parting as if she wanted to say something but stopped herself. Finally, she spoke. "I don't know. But I am the key to something important to them. Something they need to control. If they find me, they'll stop at nothing to take me." James's heart raced. He could feel the weight of her words hanging in the air. She wasn't just any alien girl, she was someone important, someone they would go to extreme lengths to find. "I won't let them take you," James said firmly, his voice strong with determination. Aurelia finally looked at him, her eyes softening just slightly. "You don't understand," she whispered. "I don't belong here. I never did." James stood up, crossing the room to where she sat today. He knelt down in front of her, looking up into her eyes. "You do belong here," he said, his voice quiet but full of conviction. "You're safe here, for now. And I won't let anyone take that away from you." Aurelia stared at him for a long time, the silence stretching between them. James could feel the weight of her doubt, but he refused to back down. He had made his choice. The outside world might be closing in on them, but for now, in this small cabin, he would protect her. It was all he could do. And it was enough. For now. The fire in the cabin was beginning to die down, casting flickering shadows on the walls. James sat by the hearth, his hands resting on his knees, staring into the fading flames. He hadn't moved much since the conversation with Aurelia, the weight of her words still heavy in his mind. The Vellor. He didn't know who they were. Or what they wanted, but he could feel the danger in her voice. She was more than just a runaway, she was part of something much bigger, something that was now pulling him in whether he liked it or not. He glanced over at Aurelia, who was sitting by the window, her back to him. She had been quiet for the past hour, lost in her own thoughts. He couldn't help but wonder what she was thinking. She had told him about the Vellor, but there was so much she hadn't said. She had to know more about them, about why they were after her, but it seemed like she wasn't ready to share everything. And James understood. She had her reasons for holding back, just like he had his reasons for trying to protect her. but the silence between them was suffocating. Finally, he stood up, crossing the room slowly to where she sat. "Aurelia," he said softly. She didn't turn, but her shoulders tensed at the sound of his voice. "You can't keep shutting me out," James continued. "I don't expect you to tell me everything, but you can't keep me in the dark either." For a long moment, she didn't respond. James waited, trying to give her the space she needed. She wasn't ready to talk, and he wasn't going to force it. But he needed her to know that he was there for her. That he wasn't going anywhere. Finally, she spoke, her voice low and quiet. "I'm scared," she admitted. James's heart clenched. He had known she was frightened, but hearing her say it out loud hit him harder than he expected. "You don't have to be alone," he said gently, his tone soothing. "We'll figure this out together." Aurelia looked out the window, her eyes distant. "I don't know if I can stay here," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "The Vellor will find me. It's only a matter of time." James shook his head. "You don't know that for sure," he said, though he wasn't sure he believed it himself. "We'll keep moving. We'll find a way to keep you safe." Aurelia turned to look at him then, her violet eyes softening. "And what about you? What happens to you when they come for me?" The question hit James like a punch to the gut. He hadn't thought about it like that. "I'll be fine," he said quickly, though the words felt hollow. "I'm not worried about me." But the truth was, he was terrified. Terrified that he was dragging her into something far bigger than he could handle. Terrified of what might happen if they were found. He wasn't a soldier, and he didn't know how to fight an empire. But he couldn't let her go. He couldn't let the Vellor take her. She deserved better than that. "We'll figure it out," James repeated, more to himself than to her. "One step at a time." Aurelia looked at him for a long moment, her gaze intense, as if she was trying to read him. Then, with a small, reluctant sigh, she nodded. "I'll stay," she said quietly. "For now." James let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with relief. He didn't know what the future held, but at least for the moment, they were safe. At least for now, they had each other. And that was enough. For now. The cabin was quiet again, but the weight of the unspoken words between James and Aurelia still lingered. They had agreed to stay in the small, isolated cabin for now, but James couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. He had promised her safety, but with each passing hour, the sense of urgency only grew. Aurelia had settled in, but James could see the tension in her eyes, the same tension that had been there since he found her. She was running from something far bigger than he could ever imagine, and he had dragged himself into the middle of it. He couldn't help but wonder if he was making the right choice, but every time he looked at her, he knew he couldn't just turn back. She needed him, even if she didn't want to admit it. He had never been a hero, never been someone who took on a fight he couldn't win. But something about her vulnerability and strength, made him want to protect her with everything he had. He sat at the table, his coffee growing cold in front of him, as he watched Aurelia from across the room. She was at the window again, staring out into the dark, as if searching for something in the distance. James had tried to get her to talk. More about her past, about who she was, but she always shut down when he pressed her. He understood, though. She wasn't ready to open up. Maybe she never would be. But that didn't matter. What mattered was that she was here, and he was here, and they had to figure this out together. "Aurelia," he said after a long silence, his voice soft. She didn't turn immediately, but she acknowledged him with a slight nod. "We have to keep moving," he continued. "We can't stay here forever. If the Vellor are coming, we need a plan." She turned slowly, her violet eyes meeting his, her expression unreadable. "I know," she said quietly. "But I'm not sure where to go. They've already been to so many places, and they'll follow my trail." James stood up, walking over to her, his mind working quickly. "Then we go somewhere they won't think to look. Somewhere no one would expect. We have to stay one step ahead of them." Aurelia didn't speak right away. She seemed to be contemplating his words, her gaze distant once more. James waited patiently, giving her the time she needed. After a moment, she turned back to him, her face softening just a little. "Where do we go?" she asked, the question carrying more weight than just a simple location. It was the question of their future, of what they were willing to sacrifice to survive. James's mind raced, trying to come up with a plan. He didn't have a map to a perfect hiding spot, and he wasn't a military strategist. But he had something more important: determination. "I don't know yet," he admitted. "But we'll figure it out. Together." Aurelia looked at him, her expression still unsure but, for the first time, not as guarded. She nodded slowly, almost imperceptibly. It wasn't much, but it was a start. James couldn't help but feel a glimmer of hope. Maybe they didn't have all the answers. Maybe the future was uncertain. But as long as they had each other, they had a fighting chance. And that was enough for now. James turned and walked toward the door, pulling on his jacket as he prepared to venture out into the cold night once again. "I'll find the supplies," he said, his voice firm. "We'll be ready." Aurelia stood there for a moment, watching him, before she nodded and turned back to the window. James knew that there was a long road ahead, filled with dangers they couldn't even imagine. But for the first time since this all began, he felt like they had a chance. He wasn't sure how they were going to survive this fight, but he knew one thing for certain: he wasn't going to let her face it alone.